to introduce this morning's panel. I'm Head of Communications for the Corporate Learning Alliance, responsible for commissioning the research we'll be discussing today. Suzanne Lucas describes herself as an evil HR lady, which she's allowed to do because she spent 10 years in human resources, hiring and firing. Suzanne now writes about how managers can manage their employees and, even more importantly, how employees can manage their managers. Suzanne's based in Switzerland, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the panel. Martin Boehm is a professor of marketing at IE Business School, and he's spent the last decade researching and consulting on marketing customer centricity. And Martin is based in Madrid, and again, a very warm welcome. Just want to say a few words about ourselves at the Corporate Learning Alliance and mYngle. Corporate Learning Alliance is unique in being a joint venture between the world's most respected business daily newspaper and news site and a world-leading business school in online and blended education. What makes us unique is the content of our customized executive programs that we design and deliver to major corporations, drawing on world-class Financial Times journalists and news content and leading professors and educators specializing in many business sectors. mYngle provides tailored online language courses with private and certified teachers expert in more than 45 languages. It offers complete, innovative language learning for HR professionals, and mYngle's approach focuses on the needs of learners and the connection between the language and its use in real situations. Okay, well, let's turn to the research. Today, we're considering the findings of an independent survey on investment in people and learning. Now, the Corporate Learning Pulse is different to the kind of survey often commissioned in the HR and talent management sector. We asked two groups of people a series of questions about their attitudes towards the investments in people they believe will have a real impact on their organizations. And the two groups were, firstly, HR and learning and development professionals who directly manage investments in people, and secondly, C-suite executives, CEOs, company chairpeople, or business owners that have an influence on these investments. Now, we consider this to be a major piece of research. It covers 7 Western European countries and a broad range of small, medium, and large businesses. The respondents were totally independent of the Corporate Learning Alliance and mYngle and were conducted by an independent research organization. Different about our research is the fact that it surveys opinions on a wide range of people investments. The list you can see here on the screen shows the options, or some of the options we gave the respondents. And as you can see, they cover not only strategic investments like hiring new talent, introducing new IT systems and executive education. It also covers areas like health and well-being, benefits in kind, and things like childcare services. So we asked the survey's participants to choose the top 3 investments that they believe have the greatest positive impact on an organization from an HR perspective. The questions were randomized so that we didn't lead them towards one option or another. And as you can see, executive education is ranked the highest. Is that people believe that investing in their existing people through executive education is more effective than hiring new talent when it comes to driving change, stimulating innovation, and improving their corporate financial prospects. This is particularly interesting because it's perhaps perceived wisdom that bringing in fresh talent can give an organization a much-needed stimulus. This is something I'll be asking the panel in a moment, and please feel free as a participant on this webinar to post a comment or question on this particular area. Investing in employees vary across the European markets we researched. The belief, well, certainly is strong everywhere, but it is strongest in Spain, the UK, and Germany. And again, it'll be interesting to hear the panel's opinions and your thoughts on this different split among different countries. We now turn specifically to executive education. Again, opinions vary across Western Europe on the effectiveness of corporate learning to achieve results. Again, the belief is strongest in Spain, and apart from France at 49% of respondents, each market records a greater than 50% positive impression of executive education. I mentioned earlier that we researched 2 main groups of executives, the C-suite and HR and learning development professionals. Now, this is where attitudes to executive education get even more interesting. The learning and development community quite rightly regard executive education as a path to better employee engagement. The C-suite, however, go further. They see it as a way of achieving something more for the organization as a whole by having an impact on areas like customer satisfaction and company profit. There is also something else we think at work here, which perhaps demonstrates the disconnect we sometimes see between the C-suite and the HR community. Our survey revealed that learning and development professionals do not believe that their business leaders recognize the full value of executive education. Again, the panel and audience on our webinar today may have an opinion on this. The same reaction also plays out when it comes to a belief not just in the need for executive education, but in the effectiveness of the programs that are developed and delivered to senior executives. Across the survey's 600 respondents, just under half are fully satisfied with the corporate learning their organizations are investing in. For the executive development sector, this raises questions about the effectiveness of learning programs and the kind of programs that are being delivered, and of course the impact they're having on an organization's bottom line, not just on employee engagement. We have perhaps the most important questions here for the executive development sector. That's impact and the ability to measure it. There is a gap between the perceived value of executive education and the ability of an organization to make a direct link to business prospects as a whole. So, I'd now like to open the discussion up to our panel and to the online audience, and in particular on the levels of belief in the ability of executive education to achieve overall business goals. So that was a very quick run through the research, and there will be a link at the end of this presentation where you can download a copy for yourself and read the full report. So, our panel, Professor Martin Boehm, Suzanne Lucas. First, I'd like to ask each of them to provide their reactions to the research, and then we'll ask them to respond to your questions, which you can, as I said, post on the screen using the Q&A. Okay, the question for both of you. Martin and Suzanne, the survey shows that executive education is considered by senior executives to be the top investment for improving business outcomes, even ahead of investing in new talent. So, to what extent is investing in existing preferable to hiring new? Suzanne, do you have a view?
Well, I do have a view, and in theory, I think investing in your current talent is the best idea, although in practice, I don't see these executives acting on what they say is important to them. It's often difficult to get people to approve things like raises as a result of gaining a new certificate, or being willing to promote someone into a stretched position. People tend to want to hire someone that can hit the ground running. And so while they say they want to educate and train, I'm not seeing it happening as much as they say they want it to happen.
I think, Suzanne, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you. But I first wanted to respond actually to David's question, and then come a little bit to your point, because I think you raised something really important. And let me tackle actually David's question a little bit more from a marketing perspective, because as you have correctly pointed out, my background is in marketing, and I obviously teach marketing here at IE Business School. So what we typically see is that as well, similar to acquiring new talent or working with your existing talent, we could actually say in marketing the analog relationship is hiring or getting or gaining new customers versus developing your existing customers. And there's actually a rich field of research on that subject that clearly highlights that actually acquiring new customers is typically 5 to 10 times more expensive than actually developing your internal customers and try to make them more profitable. My feeling is that the same is actually true as well with talent. Typically, it is more expensive to hire external talent or fresh new talent into the organization, because you typically have to invest in onboarding, have to maybe offer them certain perks as well in order to win them over, while typically investments in your existing talent not so high, or the requirement is not so high. I feel as well that obviously, I mean, like with external talent, it's a little bit like a hit and miss strategy. So you typically go through a very sophisticated selection process, but still it might actually miss certain talents, or it might actually misinterpret some of the talent that you're actually hiring or trying to hire. So there's always the risk as well of committing mistakes, and obviously that mistake is minimized, I think, when you deal with your existing employees. You just have much more data points, much more information available in order to evaluate really their talent. Let me come really quickly back to what Suzanne actually pointed out, because I completely agree with that. Interesting enough, they say developing internal talent is much more important than hiring fresh one. And sometimes we see that they don't really act on this. I completely agree on that. And here my feeling is, and that's my personal opinion, is that we have a little bit a tension happening very often between HR professionals who probably would like to rather invest in existing talent rather than hiring new ones. But very often we see, obviously, the functional managers, they very often would like to get in talent from the outside, would like to get fresh thinking in from the outside. So that's a little bit my feeling, and as a consequence, maybe the functional managers have the last word in that decision.
Well, I guess it's a balance, isn't it? Because it's not one or the other, but it depends on how far that balance goes towards, bringing in new people, having to, as you say, train them up. But if those skills aren't already existing within an organization, that clearly could be the route.
Well, but training people within the organization, you have to train someone today for a need that you're going to have in 2 years. And so a lot of times people can't see at the moment, when I come and say, I want to take this course, you can't see why you need that today, but maybe you'll need that 2 years down the road. And a lot of people prefer to wait until you need that skill and then hire someone from outside, because you can't instantly train someone to do something. Or you have to look in advance. And it costs money to do that in advance. It is cheaper to train within than to hire externally. It usually costs anywhere between 50% and 150% of someone's salary to replace them. Nobody ever wants a training class that's that expensive. But one hits your bottom line today, and the other one just kind of gets absorbed into salary costs.
As I said in the research, we didn't lead the respondents on to any particular area of investment. Obviously, for us, being in the corporate education business, it was gratifying to see that people do regard corporate learning so high in their agenda. We did look at other things, though, didn't it? Like investment in IT to make an organization work better, health and well-being programs, work-life balance issues, that kind of thing. I mean, from your experience, how high do you see those kind of things featuring in organizational priorities?
All tend to come out on top of the continual learning, in my experience, because they are immediate needs. I need a new IT system now, and I can't put that off until tomorrow. Education can always be put off until tomorrow. And I hope that I'm wrong and just cynical, and that these companies truly are investing in these people, but I just feel like they want to do it, but the other priorities, the IT gets on things. And the other thing is, when you're looking for a new job, if someone says, hey, I'm going to give you the work-life balance, whatever, you're like, ooh, that sounds great, because the new job is already a challenge. You're not necessarily asking, what are you going to do for me so that I'm prepared to go to the next level when you're considering a job, although you should be.
Let me maybe complement what Suzanne is saying, because obviously I completely agree. It's very much a response to an immediate need. I completely agree on that. Obviously, from our perspective, what we see as well is a general trend, I would say. And I think two major trends at the moment is analytics, data, and obviously in order to be able to work with analytics and data, a new IT infrastructure is very often needed. So I think I see that relationship as well. Big data in general is just a hype topic right now, and as a consequence, it might make it up on this list as well. And I think as well, subjects such as well-being, mindfulness, I think is becoming increasingly important as well. And I think that has to do to a large extent with the new expectations of the new generation coming into the labor market. I think they are looking much more for a work-life balance and are very different in that respect to maybe generations that joined 10 or 15 years ago the labor market.
Now, both of you, Suzanne and Martin, have a global perspective on this business and on HR and talent. It was interesting to see those differences. This was not a global survey; it was a Western European survey, but it did show fairly significant differences in opinion and attitudes towards the effectiveness of learning. And Spain seems to be featuring pretty highly. And Martin, of course, you're based in Spain, although again you have a global perspective. Do either of you see that difference when you're dealing with organisations across the globe or across Europe?
Go ahead, Martin.
No, Suzanne, please go.
Well, I was going to say, you can tell by my accent that I'm an American, and in the U.S., people always talk about, oh, well, Europeans do this and Europeans do that. And after moving to Europe almost 8 years ago, hearing that just makes me laugh, because there is no such thing as Europeans do this or Europeans do that. There's vast differences in culture as you go from country to country and even from region to region. So it doesn't surprise me that different areas have different emphases on corporate learning. And I would bet that there's some correlation also between the amount of longevity people stay at companies. And I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I'm wondering if it's more culturally acceptable to stay for a longer period in a company in some countries, that they're going to be more willing to focus on education for their current employees. But I don't know, that's a guess.
I have to agree. I can only guess here, especially with Spain. Yes, I'm based here in Spain, so I'm trying to make sense out of this as well from a cultural perspective. What I always feel is that in Spain in general, people tend to be, and I don't want to apologize in advance, people tend to be very much short-term oriented. So they really try to seize the opportunities around the corner. And they're more concerned about the financial results of the next quarter or maybe this current financial year, and not so much thinking ahead what might happen actually in 3, 5, or even 10 years' time. And that, I think, is very much a given, and I think is very much ingrained in the culture here in Spain. So as a consequence, I can only deduct that maybe as well when they think of executive education programs, that they have this immediate impact already in mind, and basically challenge as well the executive education providers to really think about business impact, think about being meaningful in the time, in the here and now. And as a consequence, they perceive as well a bigger impact of executive education programs. While maybe in some other markets across Western Europe, maybe there's more the attitude of development, training, or learning in general doesn't have to have as well an immediate business impact. And it's really about as well maybe motivating my employees, retaining my employees, just generally raising the level of knowledge among my staff. And as a consequence, maybe the objective is not so clear or is not so business oriented, and as a consequence is perceived less so.
And I guess the here and now is a kind of movable thing depending on the country. Now, clearly we're still going through, the world is going through huge economic changes and a lot of changes in things like trust. Just let's see what's happening in the political field. If Spain is suffering high levels of unemployment, more so than the UK perhaps, or Germany, that could well have an impact on the way organizations then feel that they need to invest in their own people and invest in learning and development, whether there are budgets available or not. Do you see that as an issue?
To some extent, yes. I think, obviously, you conducted this research at the beginning of 2016, and my feeling was that already in 2015, things had changed. It's true that unemployment rates are still fairly high in in Spain, especially compared to the rest of Europe. Nevertheless, I think the attitude has significantly changed over the last 2 years. So the attitude is much more positive. The outlook is very, very positive in general across companies. and they have a more global perspective as well, and obviously are feeling much more ready as well to embrace the global market. And as a consequence, I think generally speaking, they're less concerned about the unemployment rates. That is my feeling, at least over the last 2 years.
So, Suzanne, you can take both a European view and a North American view, I guess. Again, do you see this issue of trust within organizations and change within organizations having an impact on learning?
It absolutely has an impact on learning. If it's short, because if I feel like the company I'm working for is going to support me and promote me and all of that, then I want to become invested in them and be willing to take these classes. If I feel like they're going to kick me to the curb at some point, then I also want to get as much as I can possibly get before I leave. So, you got to cover all bases there. But one thing that companies need to do when they are investing in education is reward people for obtaining that. If you send someone back to school to get an advanced degree or a certification, and then they get that, and you don't give them a promotion to go with it, they're going to go out and look for a company that will recognize their new achievement.
Yeah. So, the research I'd like to move on to was this whole thing about impact and the effectiveness. Now, from an HR perspective, clearly it's about developing people. From the CEO or the business owner's perspective, it was about, well, yes, but what impact does that have on the company as a whole, or on customer centricity, or these sorts of areas? That's an interesting thing, and I think in a lot of corporate learning programs, I don't know how much of that sort of thing is built in yet, and I think it is changing. But I think increasingly, as there are budget pressures, people will, business owners will want to see a real true effectiveness of this learning. I mean, Martin, is that a particular thing that you're seeing happening now?
So I completely agree that this is something that is expected increasingly, and I think you already gave the main reason for that. So budget pressure obviously requires us to always keep an eye on what's actually the impact and what's the return on investment of any investment we're making in our organization. So I clearly agree on that there is a significant push in this direction. Are executive education programs factoring this in? My feeling is the large majority no. And obviously, the explanation is quite clear as well. It's not that easy making that bridge or making that connection. So it is actually quite challenging to highlight or to show the correlation between investing in executive education, in a particular executive education program, and then obviously seeing as well out of this executive education program, seeing the business impact and being able to quantify that. I think that is quite challenging for most of the executive education providers. And as a consequence, I think there are rudimentary tries, but I think that's where it stands right now, and we can there's still a lot of room for improvement, especially leveraging data and analytics that I already mentioned before.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, the structure of a lot of existing education programs is a finite period of time. The program finishes, you measure the immediate results, you get a feedback, but that relationship doesn't always continue beyond that period, where you can only measure the impact on profitability or bottom line. You need an ongoing relationship. Do you find that works within the existing structure, which is sort of contractual? You deliver a program, design, deliver, and finish. Is it reasonable to have that ongoing relationship with large organizations?
You really need that ongoing relationship. You really need to be able to monitor and to see effectiveness of programs. And, I love data. Data is fabulous. And we've often struggled in HR to use data effectively. It's a relatively new field in HR, last 15 years or so anyway. And we really need to look at the impact of those things and how that education and training plays out 5 years down the road. And we're not very good at doing that overall, partly because it just hasn't been done in the past, and partly because the workforce is pretty mobile. And so, you could say, wow, this training was really effective for this one guy, but now he's working for our competitor, so we don't really know what he's really doing. But then you have to ask yourself, what did the competitor see in him that we didn't? What were they willing to offer him that we weren't? And that's something that really needs to be a part of all of these analyses, is the impact on turnover as well.
A question from Antonio Aropalo about the Italian market. Now, I have to admit that we did not survey the Italian market, and that's probably an omission. Something we can certainly consider when we repeat the survey in next year. Antonio asks, what about the Italian market? Why is it that far from the European average? And what holds companies back about education over there? It seems like in Italy, they rather hire new staff members, but actually they don't. So I don't know whether either of the panelists have a view on Italy particularly.
Yikes, sorry, I don't know much about Italy.
Same here. I mean, it would be guessing to a large extent, yeah.
Okay. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think you raise a good point about the regionality of the survey, and I think that's something we will pick up on.
But I think it's also, you got to look at just culture, because I'm telling you, as someone that coming from outside of Europe, I'm just amazed at the vast differences in culture from places to place. So, in that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, thinking a little bit more about this impact, and again, it's a sort of regional thing to some extent. Do we think that in practical terms, how you would go about measuring profitable levels, or let's look at customer centricity, because that's something really, Martin, I know you're very closely involved in. I mean, how do you measure that, and how do you link that to the abilities of senior executives to actually drive that change?
So, I think customer centricity or marketing in general is a little bit more straightforward than still in the HR field to measure the impact, because I think it's one step less if you think about it. Obviously, let's take a very simple example. Nowadays, it is very straightforward to actually measure how much money I'm investing in my advertising campaign, for instance, and then actually link that to the impact on sales. Obviously, here what we see is it has become increasingly more simple to do so, especially because I'm using more digital channels, and as a consequence, that obviously I can track every little step. I can track any tiny impact on my sales and any step along this value chain. Obviously, we have seen as well major advances, let's say, in more traditional marketing channels, and as a consequence, it is fairly straightforward to actually get a full picture on that. I think in HR, that is probably a little bit more challenging yet, because typically, as we have mentioned before, the impact on the bottom line is much more long-term, because obviously, first of all, the training program or the development program typically takes some time. Then until really the skills fully develop, it might take yet some more time. And then actually being able to apply these new acquired skills or these new developed skills in a business context might be even more, take even more time. And I think the problem here is as well that being able to attribute, let's say, an impact on sales specifically to a training program is much more challenging, because there's so many other factors that actually impact potentially sales. I think on the marketing area, it's much more direct, it's much more short-term, and I think we have a better understanding as well of some of the other factors that might impact sales. So I think I'm fortunate, because in marketing, lot has already been done over the last 10 years in terms of investment and making sure that everything is being tracked and that sufficient data is being collected in order to measure really the impact. Nevertheless, let me conclude with one comment, because you highlighted as well not only marketing in general, but obviously customer centricity. And customer centricity is maybe more like a concept, I would say. It's more like a philosophy rather than, let's say, a specific marketing initiative. And as a consequence, even there, it still requires much more convincing among executives of seeing the benefit of that. And to some extent, I think what I realize very often as well in some consulting projects is that generally speaking, they see the benefit if you discuss it with them, but when they actually then come down to business, or when it comes down to business, they take decisions which are much more opportunistic and sometimes neglect the basic concept of customer centricity. So a little bit what Suzanne mentioned before as well, what happens very often in HR as well, is that, you know, they preach one thing, but what they actually do is something completely different.
Yeah.
And with Martin talking about marketing and sales is very easy to measure success. You know, you get a report every day or every week with your sales numbers on it. If a company invests into their accounting department or into their human resources department, there aren't hard numbers every day to show that. I can't, you know, come and say, look, because you sent me to this training, we've had, you know, 10 managers that I've been able to coach in a way that if I hadn't, they would have sexually harassed someone. I can't say, you know, I can't give data on what didn't happen. And a lot of those jobs, a lot of accounting and a lot of finance and a lot of HR are preventing bad things from happening. And that's really hard to measure on that. I mean, you can look at overall averages over the years, but it's not like a sales report that you can get every day that shows impact. So that makes it hard to sell to the senior executive that's got to approve the cost of something like that.
Which actually raises a related question. I sensed in some of the responses in the survey to some frustration among the HR community that their voice isn't being heard at C-suite level. You know, you may or may not have a seat on the board, probably not. And really, whether you can get that close to the business owners. I'll give you another example. We, at the Financial Times, a couple of weeks ago, we held a breakfast briefing about Brexit. And it was very difficult to find somebody who was in favor of Brexit, but those people who were saying, well, this is an opportunity, one of the areas was that this is an opportunity for the HR community to actually get on the front foot and actually knock on the door of the office of the C-suite and say, you need to listen to us. So whether impact is one of those areas that the HR community can actually say, look, we have a very strong impact, we can have a very strong influence on the company performance, but they've got to have their voice heard.
HR should have its voice heard. I could say as an HR person, everybody should listen to me always, but we're our own worst enemies. The reason why we don't have a seat at the table in many companies is because we flat out haven't earned it. When, you know, talking about basic HR functions, the recruiting and retention, we're terrible at the way we treat people when we're recruiting. You know, you go for a job interview and the HR person never, ever, ever gets back to you. Doesn't say whether you're being considered, doesn't say that the position's been filled, doesn't say that the position's been pulled. We just let you go. And we shouldn't do that. And I shouldn't use the word we because I would never in a million years do that. That we as a profession do that all the time across all levels and across all countries. This happens. And the result is that everybody has a bad taste in their mouth for HR. And even though the recruiter may be some 22-year-old with no experience, she's got an HR title. And that impacts the way senior executives feel about human resources. They see it as irresponsible, and we've earned that ourselves. Thank you very much. We were irresponsible, and by golly, we've got to live up to it. And we need to fix the problems on the front end in order to be trusted on the executive team. Yeah.
Now we've got a couple of questions, in fact, from the same person, Lucas Red, on the line. He asked, first of all, about, again, the regional question. Now, he says he thought that Nordic countries like Sweden, Denmark, Finland invested a lot on courses and training. I don't know whether Lucas is from that region, but that you do get the impression that the Nordics do take investment in research and development, learning and development, all those sort of areas quite seriously. Again, do the panelists have any experience of that sector, that part of Europe?
Yes, I think I agree. Typically what we see is, the Nordic countries, I would say, generally invest quite a lot. I would say, however, as I said before, I think the investments are slightly different, I think. And we see a little bit of divide, maybe to some extent, between Nordic countries and southern countries. I think in Nordic countries, we see more general investment, I have the feeling. They're typically, that's at least, again, my personal experience, I think they're doing a better job in terms of standard programs, onboarding processes, typical standard development programs. You reach a certain level of seniority, you have access to further training programs and so forth. But I think they're very standardized, very structured in their approach. While I think in southern countries, my feeling is it's more on a demand basis, as need basis, more subject specific. So there's, for instance, a particular trend or a hype topic, and as a consequence, I'm trying to educate my entire staff on that particular subject. So my feeling is, I see as well, I'm not really sure in terms of the numbers, who invests more or who invests less. But my feeling is that the type of programs they invest in or their approach to HR development is slightly different. That at least would be my feeling.
And Lucas also asked a very interesting question about, I'm just reading this. He says, talking about HR, they speak a lot, but they don't back up investment in courses, which he doesn't understand why. But also he's saying a lot of courses are not funded by government, or do we find in certain countries that there is government funding for executive education? I don't know whether I've experienced that at all.
In Switzerland, there's a lot of funding for training at the lower levels, but I'm not aware of any government funding for an executive level of training. If you want to change careers, that there are programs in place to do that, but they're expecting you to be at a lower level. But I think the reason why governments don't do that is because it's not the government that's benefiting. The people themselves benefit and the companies benefit, and overall government benefits in terms of taxes and growing businesses and such. But I think the impact is so strong on the individual and on the company that people are willing to pay for it themselves, or companies are willing to pay for it themselves. So why should we, as taxpayers, pay for you to get a special certificate in something that's going to earn you more money than I make? Why should I be paying for that? So I can see why governments aren't involved in funding executive education, but I do see it at the lower levels here in Switzerland.
I wonder. I'm sorry. I just wonder why perhaps implicit in Lucas's question is if the government was funding this, that they would expect some more, bang for their bucks or whatever. But why that would make any difference, whether it's publicly funded or privately funded, I'm not sure. Sorry, Martin, you were going to say.
No, I was about to tackle a little bit the other part, right? With HR talk a lot, but apparently they're not investing into courses. But I think there's always a challenge that we discussed before. securing the necessary financial funds, the necessary budget is always difficult, as it is difficult to actually show the immediate impact. And I think what I always see with HR departments is they have great ideas. They would love to do many more things. But then when it comes down to budget time, they have to give up certain things and they have to cut back because they're asked to cut back. And as a consequence, there's maybe sometimes the impression, lots of talk, little investment. My feeling is it's not due to the HR professionals, but very often to the finance department.
I agree. It's always finance's fault.
Of course. Well, look, we're 45 minutes into the webinar. We've covered a lot of ground. I don't have any more questions online. Are there any sort of closing remarks, perhaps, Suzanne, you'd like to say about the sort of areas we've discussed and also what the research seems to be showing?
Well, my main thing here is that it looks like the C-suite people want to invest in education, and I think that's fantastic. And if we can go back to our respective companies and say, look, this is how we need to implement this. These are the things we need to do. This is how we can track the success of this. Let's jump on this. And, if your C-suite people aren't saying that they want to do it, say, look, your competitors want to do this. Do you want people to jump ship? And maybe we can get some good quality training and education going. It benefits the company so much to have a high quality workforce. And I believe Martin talked about retaining customers is cheaper than getting new ones, and retaining employees is cheaper than getting new ones as well. And so let's do that. Let's give some education and take advantage of these numbers and convince our C-suite people to fund us.
Yeah, let's conclude as well with one thought. I think obviously this research highlights some challenges that still exist, but at the same time, we could actually turn this around and say there's still lots of opportunities for HR professionals to push the boundaries, to improve and get better. And obviously here, one of the key challenges will be to show the impact of HR professionals, of executive education training programs. And obviously, I think now with new data being collected, new IT systems allowing us to collect more data, I think we are in the perfect time or the perfect place in order to actually push the boundaries and become better and become better HR professionals. So I think it's a great time to actually work in these kind of functions in these kind of departments.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, it up there. Thank you very much indeed to Suzanne, Lucas, and Martin Bohm for what I think were some really good insights. And the audience, thank you for asking those questions as well. Now, if you'd like more information on the research, we've published a detailed document which summarizes the findings, and you can download that. And I think on the screen you can see the address. It's fticla.com/pulse, and you can see the research. We will repeat it in the new year, and hopefully we can have another one of these kind of webinars where we can then contrast the findings as they conclude. We've also made a recording of this webinar, and we will provide a link to those of you who are interested, and we'll be posting those on our respective mYngle and Corporate Learning Alliance websites. So it just remains for me to say thank you again, everybody. Thanks for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.